The moment the lawyer opened the will, I thought I knew what was coming. After all, I'd been my husband's caregiver for 8 long years, through chemo, surgeries, and sleepless nights. But then my daughter-in-law stood up, smirking, and announced that I was cut out of the $77 million estate.
My ears rang. My hands went cold. Everyone thought I'd been blindsided.
But what none of them knew was that my husband had been planning something for years, and the lawyer's quiet laugh was the first crack in their perfect little scheme. If you've ever had someone try to erase you, to take what's rightfully yours, just because they thought you were powerless, you're going to love how this story ends. Hit that like button, subscribe, and settle in for one of the most satisfying will-reading revenge stories you'll ever hear. If you'd seen us 5 years ago, you wouldn't have guessed the storm that was coming. Back then, my days started with the smell of fresh coffee drifting through the kitchen and the sound of Richard humming Sinatra under his breath while reading the paper. He was a big man, not in a loud or intimidating way, but in presence. The kind of person who filled a room just by walking into it. People respected him, admired him. And I loved him. Not the polite, distant kind of love you read about in old novels, but the deep, lived-in kind. The kind you earn over decades of shared breakfasts, rainy Sunday afternoons, and whispered conversations in the dark when the world feels too heavy.
Richard had built a shipping logistics empire from nothing.
I used to joke that he could turn a paperclip into $1 million if you gave him a week. But despite the wealth, the penthouse, the vacation homes, the black-tie galas, we were happiest when it was just us, a bottle of wine, and an old movie playing too quietly in the background.
That was our rhythm, our life. But there was always them. Richard's son, Mark, and his wife, Vanessa.
Mark was in his late 30s, handsome in that gym body, overpriced haircut kind of way.
He had inherited his father's strong jawline but none of his discipline.
Jobs came and went for Mark like seasons, always with a dramatic story about how his genius had been underappreciated or mismanaged. Vanessa was beautiful.
I'll give her that.
Sharp cheekbones, designer everything, and a smile that could light up a room, if you didn't notice the way it never quite reached her eyes.
She was polite, but only in the way people are when they are calculating something. From the beginning, I knew I'd never truly be part of their circle.
To them, I wasn't Richard's partner. I was the second wife.
The outsider.
They'd make little comments, nothing you could call them out on without sounding paranoid. At dinner one night, Vanessa forgot to set me a place at the table and laughed it off with, "Oh, you don't mind, do you? You're always watching your figure." Mark once joked in front of friends that I must be the most expensive nurse in the city since I took care of Dad all day. Whenever Richard wasn't around, Vanessa would call me dear in a tone that made it sound like maid.
I swallowed it, every time.
Because Richard loved his son, and I loved Richard. When Richard was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, the world as I knew it tilted on its axis. Everything became about appointments, lab results, medications.
I kept track of every pill, every side effect. I slept in hospital chairs.
I learned how to make chicken broth that wouldn't upset his stomach and how to smile through my own fear so he wouldn't see it in my eyes.
Mark and Vanessa? They visited, occasionally.
Always with some excuse for why they couldn't stay long, a charity event, a work trip, a friend's wedding in another city. When they did show up, it was all performative concern and expensive gifts that didn't matter. Vanessa once brought a $2,000 cashmere blanket and left the price tag on, like she wanted us to know exactly what she'd spent.
But Richard, he saw me.
Even on his worst days, when he couldn't keep food down and his hands shook so badly he could barely hold a pen, he'd take my hand and whisper, "I don't know what I'd do without you, Ellie." I didn't know it then, but those whispered moments, those acknowledgments, were planting the seeds for what would come later. Because while I was pouring my heart into keeping him alive, someone else was busy plotting how to take everything away the second he was gone. It started small. So small I almost convinced myself it was nothing. At first, it was the mail. We'd always received our financial statements at the house, neatly stacked by Richard's study door every month. But one day, I noticed they just stopped coming. When I asked Richard about it, he shrugged, said Mark had offered to help sort things out so we could focus on his treatment. That should have been a relief. But something in the way Richard's eyes darted away from mine told me it wasn't the whole truth. Then, there were the visits before. Mark and Vanessa would breeze in with their perfect smiles, drop off some overpriced gift, and leave within an hour. But suddenly, they started lingering. Not in the living room with us, but in the study, with the door closed, murmuring to Richard in low voices I couldn't quite make out whenever I walked by, the conversation would stop.
Papers would shuffle.
Vanessa's voice would go high and light as she said something meaningless like, "Oh, Eleanor. We were just talking about the weather in Aspen."
It was always Aspen.
Always the next vacation, the next charity gala, the next sign that their world was a very different one from the one Richard and I lived in during those long hospital nights. I told myself not to overthink it. That paranoia was the last thing Richard needed to see in my eyes. But then came the phone calls. Late at night, I'd wake to see the glow of Richard's phone screen in the dark. Mark's name would be there, sometimes twice in a row. Richard would read the messages silently, his jaw tightening. He rarely replied, but when he did, it was short, clipped. One night, I got up for a glass of water and heard him on the phone. "Richard, no, that's not what we agreed to. I told you, I want her taken care of. That's final." The next morning, when I gently asked who he was talking about, he smiled faintly and said, "You don't need to worry about that, Ellie." But I was worried. It got worse when Mr. Harlan, our family lawyer, began visiting the house. He'd always been polite to me before, but lately, his tone had changed, more cautious, like he was afraid of saying the wrong thing. And every meeting seemed to happen when I was out running errands or picking up prescriptions. One day, I came home earlier than expected and found the three of them, Mr. Harlan, Mark, and Vanessa, in the study.
They all froze when I opened the door.
Papers were spread across the desk, and Vanessa was leaning over Richard's chair like she owned it. She straightened slowly, that too smooth smile sliding into place. "Vanessa, Eleanor. We were just finalizing some things for when Richard gets better."
When?
Not if. The way she said it made my skin prickle. It wasn't just the meetings. It was the way they looked at me now, like I was a placeholder, not a wife. Like they knew something I didn't. The breaking point came 2 weeks before Richard's death. He'd been especially weak that day, barely able to lift his head. Mark and Vanessa had come by, all soft voices and helpful offers. I'd stepped out to take a call from the hospice nurse. 5 minutes, maybe, and when I came back, the three of them were huddled in the corner of the room. Richard looked pale, defeated.
Mark looked smug.
And Vanessa?
Vanessa was holding a pen.
When she saw me, she quickly set it down. But I'd seen enough to know something had been signed. I wanted to ask. God, I wanted to ask, but Richard's eyes begged me not to.
And so I didn't.
I just sat beside him, holding his hand, my heart pounding with the certainty that something had shifted. And by the time the funeral came, the shift had become a chasm.
Mark barely looked at me.
Vanessa acted like she was hosting a society luncheon, not burying her father-in-law. What I didn't know then was that their plan was already in motion, and they were just counting down the days until they could spring it. The day of the will reading felt wrong before it even began. The August sky hung low and gray, threatening rain. I'd been up since 4 a.m., sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea gone cold in my hands. I told myself I wasn't nervous, that this was just a formality. After all, Richard and I had talked about everything. He'd promised I would be taken care of, but there was a knot in my stomach that wouldn't loosen. When I arrived at Mr. Harlan's office, I almost turned around and walked back out. Mark and Vanessa were already there, sitting side by side like they were posing for a magazine spread. Mark in a navy suit, expensive but slightly too tight, Vanessa in a pristine cream dress with gold jewelry that glittered under the fluorescent lights. They looked like they'd come to claim a prize. I took the seat across from them. Vanessa's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Vanessa, Eleanor, you made it. How lovely." Lovely. Like I was a distant relative showing up for a garden party, not the woman who'd just buried her husband of 18 years. The air in the room was heavy, not just with grief, but with something sharper. Anticipation. Mr. Harlan, a tall, silver-haired man with a reputation for never losing his composure, adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. Mr. Harlan, we are here to read the last will and testament of Richard Whitmore. I was trying to focus, but my eyes kept flicking to Vanessa. She was leaning back in her chair, one leg crossed over the other, her manicured nails tapping rhythmically on her knee. Then, just a few sentences in, she suddenly sat forward. "Vanessa, actually, Mr. Harlan, before we waste anyone's time, I think Eleanor should know now. Richard updated the will before he passed. She's not in it." The words hit me like cold water. I stared at her, waiting for a smirk, a laugh, anything to tell me this was some cruel joke. But her face was calm, almost serene, like she'd rehearsed this moment in her head and was savoring it. Mark didn't even look at me. He was busy studying the grain of the conference table, a faint smile playing on his lips. I don't understand. Vanessa, it's simple.
Richard felt it was time to keep the estate in the bloodline. Of course, we'll make sure you're comfortable for a while. The way she said comfortable, like she was offering me a used coat, made my cheeks burn. My hands felt icy against the table. I turned to Mr. Harlan, searching his face for answers, but he was just watching. His eyes, normally impassive, held something I couldn't place. Me, is this true? Mark finally spoke, his voice smooth, measured. Mark, it's not personal, Eleanor. Dad just realized things would be simpler this way. You don't have to worry about the business, the properties, any of that. The business. The properties. The $77 million in assets my husband had spent a lifetime building. It felt like the room was shrinking, the air pressing in on me. My pulse pounded in my ears. 18 years of love, of sacrifice, of sleepless nights in hospital rooms, erased with a few strokes of a pen. Vanessa leaned back again, satisfied, and folded her hands in her lap. Vanessa, I'm sure you'll find a way to manage. And that's when I heard it, a sound so out of place in that suffocating room that it made all of us pause. Mr. Harlan was laughing, quietly, at first. A low chuckle that grew until he was smiling in a way I had never seen from him. He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. Mr. Harlan, oh, my dear Vanessa, I'm afraid you've misunderstood entirely. In that moment, I didn't know it yet, but the game had just shifted. And this time, I wasn't the one about to lose everything. Mr. Harlan's voice cut through the room like a blade. Mr. Harlan, oh, my dear Vanessa, I'm afraid you've misunderstood entirely. The tapping of Vanessa's manicured nails stopped mid-click. Her head tilted just slightly, the faintest crease forming between her perfectly drawn brows. Mark frowned. Mark, what do you mean misunderstood? We saw the updated documents. Dad made his wishes very clear. Mr. Harlan gave a slow, deliberate smile, the kind you see in old courtroom dramas right before the big reveal. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, bound packet of papers, setting them on the table with a heavy thump. Mr. Harlan, you saw a document, Mark. Not the document. What your father shared with you was, let's just say, an earlier draft. Vanessa's lips parted slightly. Vanessa, that's impossible. We were there. He, Mr. Harlan, asked me to prepare that draft so you'd think you knew his intentions. He was very specific about that request. I could feel the air shift. The smugness in Vanessa's expression faltered. Mark's jaw tightened. Mr. Harlan adjusted his glasses, opened the packet, and began to read. Mr. Harlan, Richard Whitmore, being of sound mind and body, hereby bequeaths the entirety of his estate, valued at $77 million, to the Eleanor Whitmore Living Trust, of which my wife, Eleanor Whitmore, is the sole trustee and beneficiary. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. I blinked, not trusting my own ears. Sole trustee. Sole beneficiary. Vanessa leaned forward, her voice sharp now. Vanessa, that's not legal. You can't just change things without notifying us. Mr. Harlan gave a polite, almost pitying smile. Mr. Harlan, actually, he could. And he did. The trust was finalized 3 weeks before his death, with all the necessary witnesses and notarizations. Ironclad. Uncontestable. Mark's face was turning red now. Mark, why would he do that? He told us. Mr. Harlan, he told you what you wanted to hear. Meanwhile, he told me to prepare a separate letter, to be read aloud today, explaining exactly why you're both receiving nothing. Vanessa's composure cracked. Vanessa, nothing? That's ridiculous. We're family. Mr. Harlan's tone hardened, just a fraction. Mr. Harlan, family shows up. Family cares. Family doesn't disappear when the hospital visits become inconvenient. Her mouth snapped shut. He reached into the folder again and pulled out a single envelope, cream-colored, sealed with a deep red wax stamp. My heart squeezed when I saw Richard's handwriting across the front, to be read after my passing. Mr. Harlan broke the seal and unfolded the letter slowly, deliberately. The sound of the paper seemed impossibly loud in the silence of the room. Mr. Harlan, reading to my son Mark and his wife Vanessa. Over the years, I have watched the choices you've made. I've seen the way you've treated the people in your life, including Eleanor, who has given me more kindness, care, and loyalty than I could ever repay. When I was at my weakest, she was there. You were not. This is not punishment. It is acknowledgement. You chose distance.
And I have chosen to leave my life's work in the hands of the person who chose to stand by me. Vanessa's face was pale now, but her eyes burned with anger. Mark's fists were clenched so tightly his knuckles were white. Mr. Harlan, the two of you will receive one item from my estate, the family vacation cabin in Vermont.
Mark scoffed bitterly.
Mark, well, at least there's that.
Mr. Harlan,
which was sold last month. The proceeds, $312,000, have been donated to hospice care in your names. I trust you'll appreciate the tax benefit.
The silence that followed was absolute. For the first time in months, I felt the tightness in my chest loosen. Richard hadn't just remembered me.
He'd made sure his final words would cut through every lie, every manipulation, every smug smile they'd thrown my way. And from the look on Mark and Vanessa's faces, they finally understood something they'd never believed before. They weren't the smartest people in the room. For a long moment, no one moved. The ticking of the clock on Mr. Harlan's wall filled the silence, steady, relentless, almost mocking.
Vanessa was the first to speak.
Vanessa, this is absurd. You can't just leave us with nothing. We need. She stopped herself, but it was too late.
The word need had slipped out, sharp and ugly. Mr. Harlan raised an eyebrow.
Mr. Harlan, I would think that after managing your finances so carefully over the years, you'd be fine. But if you're not, well, that's beyond the scope of this meeting.
Mark leaned forward,
his voice low but shaking with rage. Mark, do you have any idea what you're doing to us? We've been making investments based on. He cut himself off, but again, too late. I saw it then, the truth they'd been trying to hide.
They weren't just disappointed. They were desperate.
Mr. Harlan leaned back in his chair, almost enjoying himself.
Mr. Harlan, yes. The advances on the inheritance you thought you were getting. Your father was aware.
Vanessa's head snapped toward him. Vanessa, he knew. Mr. Harlan, oh, yes. In fact, he asked me to review some rather creative loan agreements you'd taken out. If I recall correctly, several are coming due within the next 90 days. Without the estate to fall back on, well, I imagine the banks will have questions.
Mark's face went from red to ashen.
Vanessa gripped the edge of the table so hard her knuckles turned white.
I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. Because in that moment, the power had shifted entirely.
Every ounce of control they thought they had over me had evaporated, replaced by the cold, hard reality that they were the ones standing on the edge of a cliff.
Mr. Harlan slid the signed trust documents toward me.
Mr. Harlan, Mrs. Whitmore, as sole trustee, everything passes to you immediately. I'll arrange for the transfer of accounts and properties by the end of the week. The weight of the pen in my hand felt heavier than I expected as I signed. Not because I doubted, but because I knew this was Richard's final act of love, and his most precise act of revenge. Vanessa pushed back her chair so abruptly it scraped against the polished wood floor.
Vanessa, come on, Mark.
We're not staying here to listen to this.
But Mark didn't move right away.
He just stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like he had words but couldn't find the right ones. I met his gaze, calm and steady.
Richard trusted me. That's all there is to it. It wasn't gloating. It was the truth.
And maybe that stung more than anything I could have thrown in his face. They left in a rush, the door swinging shut behind them, the faint scent of Vanessa's expensive perfume lingering in the air like the last trace of a storm. When the room was quiet again, Mr. Harlan smiled at me, not the sly smile he'd given them, but something warmer. Mr. Harlan, he wanted you to have peace, Eleanor. I think he succeeded. From that day forward, I didn't hear from Mark or Vanessa directly.
But I heard about them.
About how the boutique Vanessa co-owned quietly closed its doors. About how Mark sold his sports car and then his penthouse, each time to free up cash. About how they'd been spotted arguing in public, voices raised, faces tight, like the cracks in their perfect image were finally too wide to hide. Meanwhile, I was signing documents, transferring properties, and setting up donations in Richard's name. I even made sure that $312,000 from the cabin sale went directly to the hospice that had cared for him, and sent Mark and Vanessa the thank you letter from the charity.
No words. No gloating.
Just quiet, undeniable proof of what they'd lost. For the first time in months, maybe years, I could breathe without the weight of their shadow. And that, I realized, was worth more than any dollar amount. The day after the meeting, I woke to a strange quiet in my house. Not the tense, waiting kind of quiet. I'd grown used to when Mark and Vanessa were in my orbit, but a softer, lighter kind.
For the first time in months, I didn't check my phone dreading a message from them.
I didn't brace myself for another urgent family request. Instead, I made coffee, sat by the window, and watched the sun creep across the garden Richard and I had planted together years ago.
Letting go of the old chains.
Over the following weeks, my life shifted in ways I hadn't expected.
The trust transfers were finalized.
The accounts, my accounts now, were put into careful, deliberate order. I met with Mr. Harlan to create my own will, one that left nothing to chance, nothing that could be twisted the way Mark and Vanessa had tried. I sold the beach house Richard and I had loved but hadn't visited in years. The money went into a scholarship fund in his name, one that would help young architects, because he'd always believed in giving dreamers a real chance.
And I kept the cabin.
Not because it was valuable, but because it was ours. I drove there one crisp autumn weekend, took a deep breath of pine air, and for the first time in a long while, felt like I could stand in a place and know I belonged there.
The world watching them crumble.
News of Mark and Vanessa's troubles trickled back to me in pieces. I didn't seek it out, but small towns have long memories, and whispers carry easily. Mark's big investments had been built on credit and expectation. Without the inheritance, creditors came calling. His high society friends stopped inviting him to golf tournaments and charity galas. Vanessa's boutique shuttered quietly. The liquidation sales sign stayed up for months. She tried to pivot to online influencing, but it didn't take. People could smell desperation, even through a screen. The two of them were still together, technically, but sightings at the country club had them sitting on opposite ends of the terrace, barely speaking. The perfect couple facade had cracked beyond repair.
A new kind of freedom.
I didn't celebrate their downfall in the way you might think. There was no champagne toast, no smug grin in the mirror. Instead, I celebrated by planting roses in the garden Richard had loved, rich, deep red ones, the kind that take years to bloom fully. I traveled for the first time alone, visiting places Richard and I had once dreamed about but never reached. Standing on a cliff in Ireland, the wind tangling my hair, I felt him there, not in sadness, but in quiet pride. One evening, months later, I sat on the porch at the cabin with a cup of tea, watching the stars spill across the black sky.
I realized then that Richard had given me two gifts: the means to live without fear of Mark and Vanessa's reach,
and the reminder that strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just the decision to keep going, with your head held high.
They had plotted to take my future.
Instead, they handed me my freedom. And that, I decided, was revenge enough. We'll really linger on the reading of the letter. The humiliation will be slow, methodical, and devastating, like a scalpel instead of a hammer.
Listeners will feel every beat of Mark and Vanessa's downfall.
Richard didn't just leave me money. He left me dignity, justice, and the truth written in his own words. And that, more than the millions, was priceless. Sometimes the sweetest revenge isn't loud, it's quiet, legal, and undeniable. If that ending gave you goosebumps, hit that like button and tell me in the comments, what's the most satisfying revenge you've ever heard of? And of course, subscribe for more stories that prove karma always has a way of showing up.